Hi, good afternoon. I'm Louise Dawson and I'm presenting today a little bit of background history on the implementation of the Individualised Service Agreements. There are 4 documents leading up to the implementation, and I'm just going to give you a brief history here, and then I'm going to do a second video about how to access the ISA, who to complete them for and how to complete them over the next few weeks. Okay, so quick introduction. Who am I? Louise Dawson. I'm currently the head of inclusion at Jumeirah College. I have been here for 8 years in Dubai. I've kind of followed the journey a little bit, so I know the documentation that's come out and when it's come out and how that affects our provision and service within the schools. This whole process is for all schools. It's not a British curriculum thing or American curriculum. It is every school in Dubai that needs to do this. And so it's really important that you know the background to it. What do I know? I am a practicing head of inclusion, the same as you. I know no more, I know no less. I have vast experience within Dubai. I have worked at a senior level, so I'm very familiar with the documentation required by the KHDA, but I know no more than you do. And I think it's really important to say that that means what I'm saying is guidance and advice. It is not gospel and is not law. And if you are working within a school and your inclusion support team has other ideas and wants to follow those, that is absolutely fine. You have your own policy, you have your own procedure, and you follow what you feel you need to do. What I'm doing is sharing what I'm doing. That doesn't make it right for me. I'm not KHDA. I don't know any more than you do. The information I'm giving is based on May the 4th, 2020. That may change over the coming weeks, and so be aware of any improvements or changes that come out and directives that come out from the KHDA. So there are 4 documents. You've got the Dubai Inclusive Education Policy Framework, which came out in 2017. You have got the Implementation Guide that came out in 2019. And then we had the Directives in 2020. The 4th document is not on the KHDA website, but it should be available from your principals. And that was the guide to the recategorization of students with of determination. And that is a really vital part of this process and something that you should read and digest. Let's start with the definition of SEND, or student or person of determination, whichever terminology you'd like to go with. In the revised categorization framework for students determined 2019, this document here, you will note that it says through the work of a specialist and or knowledgeable skilled team as displaying almost all the characteristics of a particular category of impairment, delay, or disorder. So that specifically says that if you have a specialist in school or a person who has strong knowledge of students of determination and the students are displaying almost all the characteristics, then you can identify them as being SEND and therefore a student of determination. Those characteristics are in this document, and that's what you would refer to in order to make this judgment. I would ensure that the person making that judgment has got a qualification in SEND to make sure that they are that specialist or knowledgeable school team. The second way of identifying a child with SEND is to be formally identified or diagnosed by a qualified and licensed medical professional as having a long-term difficulty, impairment, or disorder. So by this qualified and licensed medical professional, we are talking about a doctor, we're talking about an educational psychologist, occupational therapist, speech and language, this type of professional working within our community, and you should ensure that they are registered with the CDA in order to meet that criteria. Okay. Why do we identify? So again, I've taken this out of the revised category again, so the same document, and I've taken this and just cut and pasted it exactly. Why do we identify? We identify the category and the name of the specific condition, difficulty or disorder that is assigned to each student of determination. We provide that information as required to the regulatory authorities. We should promote effective planning for students of determination to reduce the barriers to learning that they may experience. and we need it to inform the development and implementation of processes and procedures for inclusive education and improvement. So basically, we identify so that we know our students in front of us, so that we can plan and prep for them and to ensure that their needs are met, and also to provide planning and strategic development of the school needs. As our community changes, as our school changes, as our children and students in front of us change, we as leaders need to be planning strategically to make sure that we have capacity to support these children moving forwards into the future. So it helps the student, it helps the teachers, it helps the leadership, it helps the development of the school, and it helps the government. The identification of barriers to learning amongst students' determination should be conducted in parallel with their strengths and interests. This is specifically asking us not to just look at what students can't do, but also to look at what students can do and make sure that that is documented so that we're not providing a negative picture of a child. And we need to develop a comprehensive understanding of their needs and abilities and implement a more personalised approach. Okay, I think that speaks for itself. My advice would be make sure you read this document thoroughly. I know that there is, I'll come on to the other category and areas that we've noticed that there's a gap and the advice that I've taken and can share with you. So the first three documents that were released were the Dubai Inclusive Education Policy Framework, the Implementation Guide, and the Directives. So in the Inclusive Education Policy Framework, this came out in 2007. It wasn't the first information we'd had out from the KHDA. There has been laws and information out ever since the early 2000s for definite. And it is worth just looking up those documents and seeing where it all dovetails and where we all came to. Where we've come to now from those points. But the chapters within this policy were identification and early intervention, admissions, leadership and accountability, systems of support, special education centres as a resource, cooperation, coordination and partnerships, monitoring, evaluation and reporting, resourcing for inclusive education, and technical vocational education and training of higher education and post-school. This document is on the KHDA website. The link is here, and also on the very last slide here, I have put links in. So if you'd like a copy of the slides, do let me know. And when I get to the end, you can take a screenshot of the email address. So this Inclusive Education Policy Framework is where we started from. It's not going to let me load. Let's just reload that page. And so you can get this off the KHDA website. It's under the documentation section, and you can print it. What I would do is I would print it and I would make notes and annotate it and find out where your school stands in terms of meeting the requirements. Do be aware that some of the requirements have changed as you go through the documents, but it is better to do things and not need them rather than not do them and need them. So you've got all of your chapters, identification. Let's go for the first one. We've got the principles, inclusive education. Standard 1 is all about identification and early intervention. So in relation to the individualised service agreements, this is really important because the younger the child, probably the higher the need of some of our children. So you've got to identify which children require support, and you've got to make sure that that early intervention is in place. And this chapter will impact on your individualised service agreements. Standard 2 was about admissions and participation and equity. Again, this will impact on your individualised service agreements because you need to make sure that the support is in from the beginning of the time that they arrive at school, and documentation needs to be put into place. So definitely worth reading Standard 2. Standard 3 is all about the leadership and accountability. This tells you documents that you need to read. It tells you what is expected of us as professionals, which other documents. It signposts us out here to the Dubai Universal Accessibility Code, which is definitely a document worth looking through. It's all about building regulations, etc. It's a very large document. I probably wouldn't print it, but definitely you should definitely be aware that it's there, and you should be aware of some of the content. Standard 4 was the systems of support for inclusive education. Again, a chapter that you will need to read because this dovetails into the agreement. Lovely children there. Standard 5. Standard 4 also includes what sort of team you should be building. Your inclusion support team all started here. The teachers that we need, the LSAs that we need, all started here. This has developed and grown from 2017 to now. So some of this information has changed. However, I do think it's very good practice. I do think it's something that we should definitely be working towards and something you should review when you're looking at strategically planning for your department, team and support of our children. Standard 5 is all about special education centres as a resource. If this impacts on your charging parents additional funding for these services, that will impact on your ISA, Individualised Service Agreement. Standard 6 was cooperation, coordination and partnership. So this will impact where you might be using an occupational therapist to provide services to one of your children for which you are charging additional fees. So this will impact on your ISA. Fostering a culture of inclusion, all impacts. Standard 8 and Standard 9, resourcing for inclusive education. So this is again a chapter we must read and does feed back into your ISAs. It is all about the additional fees for parents and that you don't make a profit and that you do represent the actual cost of the services. So again, every single paragraph within this document needs to be read, annotated and used to plan for your ISAs. Then later in 2019, we had the second document came out, which was the implementation guide for inclusive education. Okay, and again, the chapters in here were introduction, vision, admission and access, admissions, assessment and identification, intervention, systematic support, resourcing, building inclusive network, and moving forwards. And you will see from in here, there was a lot of very, very useful information about how we actually work with the children and how we can take that inclusive policy and then start to embed it in our schools. So again, if you're new to Dubai and you haven't read this, you should. And you should annotate it, and you should definitely start to use this to plan into your strategic planning. Admission requirements, access requirements, special education needs, school assessments. This is where we got most of the information about our teams that we need to have around us, all about our school principal and their roles, the inclusion champions, support teachers, classroom teachers and LSAs. It also gave us quite a lot of information about how to work with our parents and other people within the community. So again, I won't read through this thoroughly, but it is very much a document you need to read. You need to take out some of the information. The guidance was very worthwhile and definitely helps with your strategic planning and gives you further information about the journey of your school, where you should be heading, even if you're not there yet. I don't think anybody expects us to be perfect within the first couple of years of this implementation, but definitely we need to be showing where we were in 2017. We need to be showing where we are now in 2020, and we definitely need to be showing where we're going in the future to enable better support for our children with determination. Okay. Then we had the directives came out. The directives came out this year, and they are the guidelines for inclusive education. I think this has probably been the most useful document. They've all been very informative and they've all been very useful, but this one has got some you must do this and you must not do that. Again, this hasn't become law yet, but it is going to become law. They're refining it and they're working with us as a community, all of the schools, to make sure that what we end up with is a good, solid working document. But definitely, again, use it, print it out, annotate it, and use it for your strategic development. This document has sections throughout, and they basically tell you exactly what is required. So if you go down through the introduction and you go through to developing inclusion, it's got some really useful misconceptions which you could use to advertise out to the public. You can take their words. When it comes to the actual chapter, so this is communicating an inclusive ethos, These highlighted boxes tell us exactly what we should be doing. So if you haven't got this into place already, you really do need to make sure that you've put this into your strategic plan and then that you're working on your policy. So you must have a policy for the provision of students of determination. And you know you must have because they tell us very clearly here. We need to have a vision statement. We need to have policies and procedures for admissions, and we need to make sure the objectives identified within the school's education plan are very clear. As you go through this document, you will see it becomes clearer and clearer what exactly it is that we're expected to do. Again, these boxes say we must. So the method and tools for entry assessment process are age appropriate and reflect the student's stage of development. They're very, very clear on what they want from us. And then there's the guidance on how to make that happen. Inclusive policies, we must have processes for identification, we must have a graduated system. And it goes through all of the different chapters. This page here talks to us about the individual education plan. This is the information that they expect us to gather about each child, student information, their learning profile, areas of difficulties, but you'll notice there that they've also put in the areas of strength. It's not just about the negatives of the support. How we help, what are we going to avoid? Do they need to have any access arrangements? Individualized targets, they want us to be smart and measurable, achievable, relevant, and within a specified time frame. And this all feeds into the information in the ISA, which will be in the next video. Development team, who's going to be in the team, who's going to be working around the child. So that's team around the child. Each school then needs to, this is where we get on the journey from standard school service into your ISA. Each school needs to develop a standard school service. It is required school practice. We need to work out what are we going to give all of our families, regardless of whether they're a student of determination or not, what are we going to give all of our families as a standard service? So admissions would be a standard service. English, maths and science would be a standard service. Are we going to give children, so for my school, we have access to a pastoral support and counselling support, all free of charge. They get me. I don't charge extra for my services as the head of inclusion or the leader of the provision. That comes as a standard part of the school fees. So we have to work out what is our standard school practice. If we have core LSAs that are paid for by school, how many hours could we devote to each child, for example? So in the setting that I'm in now, we would definitely be able to provide 3 hours of support from an LSA without incurring additional costs. Anything different to that would depend on what other children we have, what support we have, and we work it from there. But every school needs to specify what is our standard school support package. When you've then got a child that requires more than that standard support package, we are then allowed to put in additional fees where necessary. We have to work on it being a system of school-based support, the tiers, the levels. You need to read all of that because that will be required in the documentation. And then when it comes to charging additional fees for student support, this paragraph is then the vital one. So you must read this document. You must pick up the information from here before you start to think about your ISAs. That all feeds into our ISAs. The last document is the revised category of framework for students of determination. So this is where the KHDA have taken information from all around the world, including the DSM, and identified that we are within the UAE, we are going to categorise children into 4 groups. Our children of determination will be categorised into 4 groups. They will have a barrier to learning in cognition and learning, communication and interaction, social, emotional and mental health, and physical, sensory and medical needs. Now, anybody that's worked with children over a period of time will know that sometimes our children overlap between those groups. So what the KHDA are asking us to do is to identify the main barrier. So is the main barrier a physical barrier, getting into school, getting into classrooms, or is it medical, as in they need, if they have something like epilepsy, so that would be the biggest preventer. If it's not controlled by medication, that would be the biggest barrier to lessons. So you've got to prioritize one, and then, as we know, there will always be, well, not always, sometimes there will be additional needs underlying your main barrier. So for each child, you need to categorize them into one of these areas, and then there will be subsidiary identifying factors underneath that. What we know from communication across the community is that some of the identifiers that we use in the schools are not listed on this documentation. For example, something like Down syndrome. Now, there's two ways around identifying a child with a need which is not listed here. You will note that there is a other category, and so you can just instantly put those children into a group and label them as other. If you don't want to do that, so we know that somebody with Down syndrome may have a physical need, they may have a cognitive need, they may have a mental health need. So what I would do is I would take the highest barrier, the strongest barrier, the biggest level of need, and put them into that category. So if I had a child with Down syndrome who was physically absolutely fine, no physical challenges whatsoever, no mental health challenges, socially and emotionally he's fine, he's at peer level. However, he did have a specific learning disorder such as literacy or numeracy, then I may put his barrier as being multiple disability, or I might put it as a specific learning disability. You're going to need to categorize your students based on your knowledge of them and their largest barrier. Okay, so they may have, if they have Down syndrome, but they have a mild intellectual disability, you can plot them into this category. Otherwise, you would just include them in the other category. And this document is going to be very important for your ISA documentation. Okay, there's the bibliography. Take a photograph, get your phones, quick, and make a note of my email address if you've got any additional questions. I will reiterate, I'm not speaking on behalf of GEMS. I know no more than you. I'm a head of occlusion, working at the same level as you, sharing my understanding, which could be right, but it also could be wrong. Formulate your own ideas. You're all very educated people, but I hope that this helps, especially if you're new to Dubai. I hope that this helps you on the journey to the ISA. I'm going to make another short video now, hopefully a bit shorter, on the ISA.